How to save your country from nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union once considered nuke China, and the United States supports that. If you were the leader of China at that time, a comparatively weak nation, how would you save 800 million of your countrymen? Why Chairman Mao wants to abandon all the Chinese territory? This is the most classic three-we-kill scenarios in human history. At the height of the US-Soviet Cold War, the USSR interfered in China's internal affairs and was rebuffed. In 1964, China successfully tested its first atomic bomb. In 1969, during the Zhenbao Island incident, China repelled a Soviet incursion and captured its most advanced tank, the T-62. The Soviets felt humiliated. Brezhnev prepared a surgical nuclear strike aiming to destroy China. To avoid a direct confrontation with the United States, the USSR informed Washington of its nuclear striking plan. The United States, however, believed China could be wiped out by the Soviets, but only if the Soviets first suffered massive losses from China, so the United States could win without fighting. Therefore, the United States deliberately leaked the plan to China, warning to prepare for war. At the time, China's nuclear weapons had almost no long-range strike capability. Nobody wants to surrender, but everyone knew the war could not be won. The recommendation was to abandon the plains and cities, retreat into the mountains, buy some time to produce intercontinental nuclear missiles, and then retaliate against the Soviet homeland. When the world's two strongest powers both want you to die, if you were Chairman Mao at that time, how would you protect your country and your people? Is there any way to preserve peace with dignity and zero cost? Anyway, Mao Zedong announced China would not launch a single nuclear missile at the USSR and would immediately abandon all the Chinese territory. What? Sounds strange, doesn't it? Was Mao surrendering? Even the military leadership didn't understand. Then Mao explained with 3 steps. First, if the USSR nuked China, the Chinese army would immediately abandon the homeland, then march straight into Soviet territory. Militias, logistics units, and all the Chinese civilians would follow. After nuclear strike, China's land would be contaminated, no longer able to produce food. We should farm and settle in the Soviet. 800 million Chinese nationals would become deeply intermingled with the Soviet population. You within me, me within you. Could the USSR then nuke its own land and people? We don't know yet. The USSR was vast and sparsely populated. People were scattered, targets hard to identify. Surely it couldn't bomb the entire USSR, and if the Soviet government went mad enough to nuke its own territory, then the advance would continue into Europe. Second, since the USSR feared a direct conflict with the United States, so the United States had to be dragged into a nuclear war. Although China's long-range nuclear strike capability was limited, China would launch all its existing nuclear weapons at US military bases in Japan and South Korea, where about 200,000 US troops were stationed. America's interests in the Asian Pacific would be reduced to ashes. The United States would certainly want to retaliate against China, but sorry, we already be waging guerrilla warfare inside the Soviet homeland. Would the United States bomb China again? Well, what would be the point? To retaliate against the Chinese, it would have to nuke Soviet territory, thus a US-Soviet nuclear war would be achieved. Third, if the United States mad enough to nuke the USSR, parts of Soviet territory would also be contaminated. At that point, China would negotiate peace with the Soviets, demanding passage through Soviet land directly into Europe. With only 200 million, the USSR would face the enormous pressure of 800 million Chinese conducting a counter-invasion style colonization, and would have no choice but to agree. Europe, with only about 600 million people in total, would then be forced into the conflict as well. European countries would ultimately declare that if the USSR nuked China, Britain and France would also nuke the USSR. If Europe were contaminated later, then if only 400 million Chinese remained, we would do everything possible to cross the Atlantic and occupy the American homeland. Then China communicated this entire strategic concept to USSR, the United States, and Europe. Whoever dares to start a nuclear war, whoever dares to destroy my home, then your home becomes my home. The Nixon administration quickly made its position clear. It opposed a Soviet nuclear strike on China. In the end, on September 11, 1969, a ceasefire was reached along the Sino-Soviet border, and the USSR abandoned the nuclear strike plan. You see, the mere simulation of this swap-home strategy avoided any real fighting, achieved Sino-Soviet peace, and ultimately led the United States to realize that destroying China by nukes was not feasible. In 1971, Nixon visited China and diplomatic relations followed. So who says the weaker side has no choice but to die? When you have a real strategy, what do you think?